The subject peasantry, widespread use of the service tenant instead of a salary, supremacy of specialized warrior class, ties of obedience and protection that bind man to man, and fragmentation of authority that inevitably leads to disorder. This is how French historian Marc Bloch described feudalism, or more specifically, Japanese feudalism that occurred roughly between the 13th and 18th century. When most people think of feudalism, they often think of the knights and castles that define European feudalism. And although Japan had their own versions of knights and definitely had castles, Japanese feudalism is a little bit different than European feudalism. Japanese feudalism can best be described as having the supremacy and importance and significance of the warrior class and the military's role in authority. That's why when people think of Japan in this era, they often think of samurais with their long swords and cool armor, because those people had the most authority back then and were the most respected. Feudal Japan can be divided into three main classes: the ruling class, the warrior class, and the peasant class. At the bottom of the peasant class, you have the merchants, which is a little bit unusual because in European feudalism, merchants had accumulated a lot of wealth and had gotten a lot of political power from that wealth. But in Japanese culture, there's an emphasis on productivity, and since merchants don't actually produce anything, they only sell things, they were kind of shunned by society. Most of the peasant class was made up of fishermen, farmers, and other tradesmen who would live in little villages that were owned by the daimyo, that the land was owned by the daimyo, which were basically the feudal lords or the barons of feudal Japan. And they would let the villagers build villages on their land in exchange for taxes and other things, whether that tax be in rice or in money. There's also another group called the hinin, which were kind of like your social outcasts. They worked the jobs that were kind of unsightly. That would be like butchers, tanners, people who dealt with waste and trash and things like that. Now, onto the warrior class. The samurai, or as they were known back then, bushi, were specialized warriors, very talented in both swordplay and archery. They were expected to be deeply rooted in Japanese culture and practice things like calligraphy and poetry, but those weren't the primary purpose of the samurai. The primary purpose of the samurai was to essentially act as the private military of the daimyo lord that employed them and protect the villagers of that lord. When the villagers were in the presence of a samurai, they were expected and legally obligated to bow. The samurai had the moral duty to protect their lord and the villagers of their lord according to their code of honor called the Bushido. The Bushido demanded that the samurai act loyally and honorably in every situation in life and death. Now, my favorite example of this is the practice of honorable suicide that the samurai did. So the idea was that if a samurai brought disgrace to his master or his lord, he would essentially kill himself with his own weapon as a noble act of honor. There is also a story that used to be a folktale that has now been adapted into movies called the 47 Ronin. The story of the 47 Ronin tells of 47 samurai who avenged the death of their lord, who was wrongfully spurred to commit seppuku by another rival lord, and how they avenged him and paid the ultimate price. Another fun fact about samurai is that a lot of them were actually another fun fact about samurai that a lot of people don't know is that a lot of samurai were actually women, and they were expected and held to the same standards in training and combat that men were held to. Now, moving on to the ruling class, we got the daimyo, or barons. They acted as the feudal barons, and they were given their land by the shogunate, and they would pass their land down to the villagers, who would then farm it and stuff like that, and they would receive their taxes from the villagers, and in exchange for undying loyalty and taxes. They weren't bound by the Bushido like the samurai, but they also had the moral responsibility to protect the people living on their land. Now, they answered to the shogunate, or the shoguns, which were basically the military dictators of feudal Japan, and the shogunate commanded large armies internationally and were basically the head military of Japan. Uh, they were they technically had all the political power in Japan, as the emperor was mostly a religious figure and not a political one. Um, yeah, and that's about it. Uh, I chose a topic that I'm not that familiar with, so any feedback is much appreciated. Thank you.